My son told me his brunch reservation was more important than my heart specialist appointment. He was hoping my health would quietly fail. So I made another call not to reschedule, but to an old friend who helped me rewrite my will and ensure my son would inherit nothing but the consequences. This is how I reminded them that a mother's love is not a blank check for cruelty. They said my silence was a sign of fading, but they were wrong. Silence isn't an ending. It is a space where memory sharpens its blade. My name is Eleanor, and for the past 5 years, the house my late husband Richard and I built in the high desert of New Mexico had become my gilded cage. I exist within these walls as a character in a story they write every day, the story of the frail, fading matriarch. They don't know I hear them scripting my final chapters. The air once filled with the scent of pignon and the sound of Richard's laughter now holds the stale, heavy perfume of my daughter-in-law Tiffany's ambition and my son Mark's complicity. They believe my health is a liability. They can no longer afford a plot point that needs a quick resolution. So they started refusing to take me to my doctor's appointments, hoping nature would simply deliver the ending they desire. They didn't account for a twist in their narrative. My doctor, James Peterson, is not just a medical professional. He was my husband's oldest friend, a character from a past they never bothered to read. They didn't know that a single phone call would allow me to seize the pen to rewrite not just my will, but the very foundation of the life they had built on top of mine. They saw me as a ghost, a remnant of a past they were eager to renovate. I had become the background hum of an appliance noticed only when it was in the way. But a ghost is just a memory with unfinished business. This is the story of how they mistook my quiet endurance for surrender, and how I reminded them that the woman who signs the checks is the one who truly owns the story. The quiet oppression didn't begin with a slammed door or a raised voice. It was a slow, meticulous process of erasure, like a patient editor redacting a lifeline by line. It started with small, seemingly insignificant changes. The family photos on the mantelpiece, the ones of Richard and me in our youth, were gradually replaced by glossy portraits of Mark, Tiffany, and their children. My favorite armchair, the one Richard had bought me, was moved to the corner of the sunroom to make more space for entertaining. Tiffany explained with a smile that never reached her eyes. Then my world began to shrink. First, my input on the garden was ignored. The roses Richard and I had planted were ripped out to make way for a minimalist rock garden that looked as sterile and cold as Tiffany's heart. Then came the food, a primal tool of control. My portions became smaller, plainer. Notes would appear on items in the refrigerator. For Mark's lunches only, do not touch. I, who had cooked thousands of meals in this kitchen, was now treated like a stranger at my own table, a guest whose welcome had long since expired. They were writing me out of my own home, one quiet humiliation at a time, confident that the character of the old woman was too weak to protest. They were about to learn that even the quietest characters can have the most powerful monologue saved for the final act. This house was not just wood and adobe. It was a testament to a life's work, the physical embodiment of a story they refuse to read. They walk through these rooms and see only space and possessions. They don't see the prologue. They don't see Richard and me younger and full of a hope they cannot comprehend, buying this land when it was nothing but sagebrush and dust. They don't feel the phantom ache in my hands from mixing the mortar ourselves, our laughter echoing against the frame of what would become our legacy. This house was built with love, a concept Tiffany seems to view as a currency for others to spend on her. When Mark married her, a woman whose eyes held the cold, calculating gleam of polished silver. We saw only his happiness. To them, the story begins at their wedding. The preceding chapters, the ones about our struggles and savings, are irrelevant. To help them start their life without the burden of debt, we sold our smaller, paid-for retirement home in Santa Fe. We handed them every cent for the down payment on this, our family home. I remember the look on Tiffany's face, not gratitude, but a quiet appraisal, as if she were inspecting an asset that was rightfully hers. I didn't ask for my name to be on the deed. I was content to be the silent benefactor. But Richard, my pragmatic and loving Richard, insisted. "A foundation needs all its pillars, Eleanor." He'd set his voice firm as he signed the papers. "Never let them forget who holds up the roof." It was a line of dialogue they have since forgotten. After he passed, that role of silent support became my entire identity in their narrative. I was the family's invisible engine, the plot device that made their lives easier. I used my nursing pension to fund Tiffany's fleeting dream of an online boutique selling overpriced turquoise jewelry. It folded within a year. I paid their country club membership so Mark could network with men whose approval he desperately craved, and I became the unpaid caregiver for their children every summer, every school holiday. I watched them, cooked for them, sang them the same bedtime songs I once sang for their father. I was the ATM that wired the funds, the nanny who asked for nothing, the emotional bedrock they stood upon without ever looking down. They had forgotten that an engine, when neglected, can be shut down. They had forgotten that foundations, when undermined, can crack. They live in a house whose moral deed is written in my sacrifice, but they only recognize the paper title they believe will one day be theirs. In the story, they tell themselves, I am merely the kindly old woman in the first act, destined to gracefully exit, so the real protagonists can claim their inheritance. They have no idea that this old woman remembers every word of the prologue, and she knows exactly how this story is going to end. The cruelty did not arrive like a thunderstorm. It was a slow, creeping fog, a calculated campaign of neglect they called care. In their story, this is the part where the old woman's needs become too much, justifying their actions. In my story, this is the chapter where they began to actively write my ending. It started with the small things, the quiet acts of erasure that would seem like nothing to an outsider. My mail would sometimes be misplaced, especially letters from my old nursing colleagues. "Oh, Eleanor, I haven't seen anything," Tiffany would say, her eyes wide with feigned innocence. I knew she was screening my connections to the outside world, isolating me. They installed a new digital thermostat, a sleek, modern device that I wasn't supposed to touch. "We've set it to a medically optimal temperature for you, Mom," Mark would explain, as I shivered through the cold desert nights under 3 layers of my late husband's wool blankets. Then came the whispers, always just loud enough for me to hear, as I sat in my armchair pretending to read. "She's getting so forgetful." Tiffany would sigh to Mark in the kitchen, her voice dripping with counterfeit concern. "Are you sure she took her heart medication this morning? I found a pill on the floor." I, who had managed an entire hospital ward, was now being painted as too senile to manage my own pillbox. My heart condition, a quiet but persistent ailment that required diligent monitoring by Dr. Peterson, became their primary weapon, the foreshadowing in their dark narrative. The missed appointments began as plausible accidents. The first was due to a sudden scheduling conflict with one of the children's soccer games. The next was canceled because their anniversary brunch reservations were absolutely non-refundable. I would sit dressed and ready, purse in my lap, only to be told an hour before we were due to leave that our plans had changed. Each missed appointment was a small, deliberate snip at my lifeline. It was a form of violence so quiet you could almost miss it. As the Roman philosopher Seneca once wrote, "A sword is not the only thing that kills. Sometimes it's a missed appointment. Sometimes it's the slow, steady drip of neglect." I felt the cold certainty settling in my bones that they were not forgetting. They were waiting. They were waiting for my body to fail, for my story to reach its inevitable, tragic conclusion. They were just trying to speed up the final pages. They never imagined I might start a new chapter on my own. Every story has an inciting incident, a single moment where the protagonist can no longer remain passive. My moment arrived on a Tuesday morning, crisp and clear, the kind of New Mexico day that makes you believe in new beginnings. I had a follow-up appointment with Dr. Peterson, a crucial one, to discuss the results of my recent stress test. He had called me himself to emphasize its importance. I had reminded Mark the night before, my voice calm but firm. "It's at 11, I told him. "We can't miss this one." He had nodded his eyes on the television, his attention already elsewhere. I was dressed and waiting in the living room, an hour early, my purse in my lap, my hands neatly folded. The quiet ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall measured out the minutes of my growing anxiety. At 10 o'clock, Tiffany descended the stairs. She was not dressed for a trip to a medical clinic. She wore a silk dress and heels, a cloud of expensive, cloying perfume, heralding her arrival like a toxic fog. She did not look at me. She went to the mirror in the entryway and adjusted an earring. "Eleanor," she announced to my reflection, "we're going to have to reschedule that appointment." My son followed her down the stairs, a silent shadow in her wake. "Mark and I have brunch reservations with the Hendersons," she continued, her voice bright and brittle. "Bill Henderson is considering Mark for a partnership. It's terribly important for his career, you understand." It wasn't a question. It was a decree. I looked past her to the son I had raised. "Mark?" I asked, and my voice, to my own surprise, was steady. This was his moment. In the narrative of his life, he could choose to be a hero, a man of character who stood by his mother, or he could be the coward. He wouldn't meet my eyes. He stared at the polished hardwood floor as if it held the answers to the universe. "It's just a checkup, Mom," he mumbled, his voice thick with shame he was trying to swallow. "It can wait. This is a big opportunity." In that moment, the fog of my own hope, the stubborn belief that my love could somehow recall him to his better self, finally burned away. The ticking of the clock seemed to grow louder, each tick a word: fool, fool, fool. I was not a mother in this house. I was an inconvenience. I was a line item on their budget that they were actively trying to zero out. And my life, my actual beating heart, was worth less than a mimosa and a potential business deal. For a moment, I felt shame, the quiet, aching kind that makes you feel like a fool for ever loving someone so completely. Then the shame hardened into something else. Something cold, sharp, and clear. This was not just a canceled appointment. This was the final straw. This was the end of their story and the beginning of mine. I did not argue. I did not raise my voice. I simply watched them leave, the sound of their expensive car pulling out of the driveway echoing like a gavel striking wood. I turned from the window and walked back to my bedroom, my steps measured and deliberate. I was no longer a character in their sad little drama. I was the author, and it was time for a plot twist. I sat on the edge of the bed Richard and I had shared for 40 years and looked at his photograph on the nightstand. His eyes, so full of foresight and pragmatism, seemed to be watching me, waiting for me to remember the woman he had married, not a victim, but a survivor. For years, I had kept the peace. I had endured the quiet slights, the escalating neglect, telling myself it was for the sake of family. I had practiced a form of maternal stoicism, absorbing their casual cruelty as if it were a law of nature. But what family was left? A son who chose a promotion over his mother's heartbeat. A daughter-in-law who saw my death not as a tragedy, but as a financial strategy. Motherhood is not a contract for endless forgiveness. It is not a vow of martyrdom. Love is not supposed to be a weight that crushes you into silence. And in that quiet room, something inside me settled. It was not anger, not yet. Anger is a hot, messy emotion. This was something colder, purer. It was clarity. It was the chilling, liberating realization that I owed them nothing more. My love and my sacrifices had been taken not as gifts, but as entitlements. They thought my age made me weak. My quietness made me foolish. My grief made me pliable. They had forgotten that I was the daughter of a bookkeeper and the wife of an engineer. I understood ledgers. I understood foundations. I understood that a structure built on a faulty premise cannot stand. They had built a coffin out of paper. Their assumptions about my senility, their expectations of inheritance, their disregard for my life, and they had signed my name across the lid. They thought silence meant surrender. It was a fatal miscalculation. My silence had not been surrender. It had been observation, and I had observed enough. The woman they saw as a background character was about to step into the spotlight and deliver a monologue they would never forget. I was not crazy. I was not weak. And I was done pretending not to notice the poison they were feeding me, one spoonful of neglect at a time. My hands did not shake as I reached for the old leather-bound address book on my desk. Every character in a story needs an ally, and I knew exactly who mine was. The main character in their narrative, the frail, forgetful old woman, was about to make a phone call that wasn't in their script. I bypassed the main clinic number, my finger tracing its way to a private line I hadn't called in years. This was the number for a character from a previous happier story, James Peterson. He wasn't just my cardiologist. He had been Richard's closest friend since their days at university. They had fished the Rio Grande together, debated politics until dawn, and stood as best men at each other's weddings. He was a link to a past of loyalty and honor that my son had long since abandoned. The phone rang twice before he answered, his voice, as always, warm but professional. Dr. Peterson. I took a breath, feeling the cool resolve solidify within me. James, it's Eleanor, I said. The professionalism in his voice vanished instantly, replaced by a genuine concern that felt like a balm on a wound. Eleanor, is everything all right? You missed your appointment this morning. My office tried to call. My voice was calm, a quiet statement of fact, devoid of the emotional chaos churning within me. Yes, James. That's precisely why I'm calling. They wouldn't bring me. I need to see you today, if at all possible. Privately. I paused, letting the weight of the unspoken hang in the air. And I have another question for you. Do you know an exceptionally good, exceptionally discreet lawyer? There was a silence on the line, but it was not an empty one. It was a silence filled with decades of friendship, of shared history, of a loyalty that my own son could no longer comprehend. I could feel him connecting the dots, the physician in him, assessing the symptoms of a sickness far deeper than a heart condition. Eleanor, he said. Finally, his voice now grim and fortified with a cold, hard anger on my behalf. My last patient is at 2. Come to my private office at the back of the clinic at 3 o'clock. Use the rear entrance. And don't you worry about the lawyer. I know just the person. She's a shark, the kind you need when you're swimming with barracudas." I hung up the phone. The first move had been made. The forgotten character had just activated a powerful ally, and the balance of power in this sad little story had just begun to shift. They were at their brunch, toasting to a future built on my erasure. They had no idea I was about to rewrite the entire epilogue. Mark and Tiffany returned that afternoon, smelling of champagne and self-satisfaction, their laughter echoing in the entryway. They were the triumphant main characters returning from a successful subplot. They offered no apology, only a condescending, "See, Eleanor, everything's perfectly fine. You worry too much." I simply nodded from my armchair, a book open but unread in my lap. I did not tell them that while they were toasting their future, I had been securing mine. I did not tell them I had used the emergency credit card Richard had insisted I keep, a card they didn't know existed, to book a private town car service. My quiet act of rebellion was already in motion. At 2:30, a sleek black sedan pulled silently into the driveway. Tiffany watched from the kitchen window, her brow furrowed in confusion. Her perfectly curated narrative didn't include unscheduled arrivals. "Who is that?" she asked, her voice sharp with suspicion. I closed my book, stood up, and took my purse from the side table. My movements were slow, but they were my own. "I have an appointment," I said, my voice as neutral as the desert landscape outside. I called a car. The look on her face was a mixture of shock and indignation. It was the look of a director whose supporting actor had just gone off script. Mark just stared, his mouth slightly agape, the perfect picture of a man whose complicity had just been bypassed. The drive to the clinic was a silent pilgrimage. With every mile that separated me from that house, I felt the weight of their story, the suffocating narrative of the helpless old woman lifting from my shoulders. The high desert landscape rolled past the window, the resilient chamisa, the steadfast juniper, the vast open sky. It was a landscape that understood endurance. It was a landscape that knew silence was not emptiness, but strength. I was no longer Eleanor, the tolerated ghost they were trying to exorcise. I was Eleanor Reed, the architect of my own life, on my way to meet the men who would help me draw up the new blueprints. For the first time in years, I was not a passenger in someone else's story. I was in the driver's seat, and I was heading towards justice. James Peterson's private office was a sanctuary of old-world dignity, a stark contrast to the sterile modern aesthetic Tiffany so desperately curated. It was a room that held history. The walls were lined with dark wood bookshelves, filled not only with medical texts, but with worn copies of the classics and histories of the American West. The air smelled of old paper and leather. On his desk, dominating the space, sat a large framed photograph of him and Richard Young, and laughing on a fishing boat on the Pecos River, a testament to a friendship that spanned a lifetime. This was the story's true Northa place of unshakable loyalty. He greeted me at the door, not with a physician's professional distance, but with a concerned embrace that spoke volumes. "Eleanor, I'm so glad you came," he said, his voice low and serious. He led me to a comfortable leather chair, and for a few minutes he was all doctor. He took my blood pressure, his lips tightening into a thin line as he read the gauge. He listened to my heart with his stethoscope, his expression growing more grave with each beat. "Eleanor," he said, setting his equipment aside, his gaze unflinching, "your pressure is dangerously high. At this level, we're not just talking about long-term risks. We're talking about an immediate threat of stroke. Skipping these appointments, neglecting your medication, this isn't a minor issue. It's life-threatening." He let that sink in before his next words came sharp and direct. This isn't just neglect. This is endangerment. Now tell me everything. And I did. I calmly recounted the timeline, the missed appointments, the flimsy excuses, the whispers, the chilling realization of their motives. I spoke without tears, my voice a steady monotone that gave the facts a terrible weight. The physician in him listened to the medical details, but the old friend listened to what was between the lines, the story of a profound and calculated betrayal. When I finished, he was silent for a long moment, his fingers steepled under his chin. The silence wasn't empty. It was the quiet hum of a powerful mind processing information and formulating a plan. He looked at the photo of him and Richard, and then back at me. Richard would never forgive me if I let this stand, he said, his voice a low growl. And I won't forgive myself. He picked up his phone, his movements now brisk and decisive. Maria, he said to his private secretary, please get me Sarah Albright on the line immediately. Tell her it's for James, and tell her it's about Richard's wife. The ally had been briefed. The next phase of my rebellion was about to begin. Sarah Albright was not what I expected. In my mind, a shark of a lawyer would be a man in a pinstripe suit. Instead, the woman who greeted us in the private conference room of her firm was in her 40s, sharp, and impeccably dressed in a tailored navy suit, but her eyes held a calm, intelligent warmth that put me immediately at ease. This was a room of quiet, understated power, much like the woman herself. The firm of Albright and Associates was the setting for the story's climax, the place where the legal machinery would engage. James had briefed her on the drive over. She didn't waste time on pleasantries. She gestured for me to sit a legal pad and a gold pen already in her hand. Mrs. Reed, she began, her voice a soothing but firm alto. James has given me the broad strokes. Now I need to hear it from you. Everything. Once again, I recounted my story. The backstory of sacrifice, the slow, creeping erasure of my presence, the final brutal dismissal of my health for a brunch reservation. I watched as her pen moved swiftly across the page, her expression a mask of professional empathy. She didn't interrupt. She let me finish, letting the silence in the room hold the weight of my narrative. When I was done, she looked up, her eyes meeting mine with a directness that was both comforting and formidable. Mrs. Reed, she said, her tone shifting from empathetic listener to legal strategist, let's be perfectly clear. What your son and daughter-in-law are doing is not just morally reprehensible. It constitutes a pattern of behavior consistent with elder abuse and financial exploitation under New Mexico state law. We have options, powerful ones. She slid a file across the polished mahogany table. James mentioned the house. I took the liberty of pulling the county records before you arrived. She opened the folder, revealing a copy of a deed. Your late husband's foresight was remarkable. The property is held in a revocable living trust with you as the primary trustee and sole lifetime beneficiary. Your son and his wife are listed only as successor trustees, meaning they have zero legal control or ownership rights while you are alive. The house is, for all legal intents and purposes, entirely and unequivocally yours. The words settled over me, not with a crash, but with the quiet, profound weight of a forgotten truth. It was a shield of paper, a legal fortress Richard had built for me years ago, and I had forgotten I possessed the key. Sarah Albright had just handed it back to me. The story wasn't over. The power was and always had been mine. The trust protects the house, Sarah Albright explained, her voice pulling me back to the present. But the will is another matter. As it stands, your current will leaves the remainder of your estate including your substantial investment portfolio and all personal effects to your son Mark. We can change that today. I thought of Richard, of his deep-seated belief in charity, in leaving the world a little better than he found it. His legacy was one of building, of giving, of quiet philanthropy. It was not a legacy to be squandered on country club memberships and fleeting social status by people who didn't understand its value. The protagonists of this story would not be my ungrateful son and his avaricious wife. The true hero of the final chapter would be the community. I want to create a foundation, I said, and the words once spoken felt as solid and real as the mahogany table beneath my hands. My voice found a new strength, a new purpose. The Richard and Eleanor Reed Foundation for Elder Dignity. Its purpose will be to provide legal aid and support for elderly individuals in New Mexico who are facing neglect, abuse, and exploitation. Sarah Albright's pen flew across the page, her earlier warmth now sharpened by a fierce, focused energy. She was not just a lawyer, she was a builder, and we were drafting the blueprints for a new kind of legacy. We spent the next hour meticulously restructuring my entire estate. The house upon my passing would be sold, with the full proceeds becoming the foundation's first major endowment. The investment portfolio, every stock and bond Richard and I had so carefully chosen over the decades, would be transferred into the foundation's control. My personal effects, the art, the jewelry, the history contained in this house, would be auctioned, with all funds directed to the same cause. To Mark and Tiffany, I left $1 each. This is a standard legal practice, Ms. Albright explained gently, seeing the question in my eyes. It's called a disinheritance clause. It demonstrates that they were not forgotten or overlooked, but deliberately and intentionally disinherited. It makes the will much harder to contest. By the time I signed the new documents, my hand steady and sure, the sun was setting, casting long, dramatic shadows across the conference room. It felt like the dawn of a new day. I had not just changed a legal document. I had rewritten the future. I had taken the narrative they were trying to force upon me, a sad tale of a forgotten old woman, and transformed it into a story of enduring strength and purposeful giving. Their story ended in a single dollar. Mine was just beginning. Returning to the house that evening was like stepping back onto a stage set after a secret rehearsal. The plot had fundamentally changed, but the other actors were still performing the old script. I was an undercover agent in my own home, living within the fortress of their ignorance. The air was thick with their arrogance and my secret. They were in the kitchen when my town car dropped me off. I saw Tiffany's face, a mask of irritation, watching from the window. "Where have you been?" she demanded, as I walked in, her voice a sharp, accusatory blade. "Did your little appointment run late?" I offered a simple, placid smile, the kind they had mistaken for senility for so long. "I was just taking care of some personal affairs," I replied, my voice calm and even. I walked past them, not waiting for a response, and went to my room. I could feel their eyes on my back, their minds racing to fit this new independent action into their narrative of my decline. The days that followed were a study in quiet observation. I moved through the house with a profound and private sense of calm. I ate the simple, joyless meals they prepared. I listened to their empty chatter about their friends, their careers, their children's latest achievements. I nodded politely when they spoke to me, which was rare. I became a master of my own performance, playing the part of the frail, quiet woman they expected me to be. They saw the same fading character, the same gentle slide into irrelevance. They had no idea they were living on borrowed time in a house whose moral and legal foundations had been completely redrawn beneath their feet. They mistook my silence for surrender, but it was strategy. They mistook my calmness for confusion, but it was clarity. I was not waiting for an ending. I was waiting for the perfect moment to deliver the climax. Every quiet moment, every polite nod was a tick of the clock counting down to the moment their world would collapse. They were the ones who were truly ignorant blind to the fact that the story had a new author, and she was about to write them out of it completely. A week after my visit with Sarah Albright, I decided it was time to introduce a new element into their narrative. It was time to plant a seed of doubt, to gently stoke the embers of their greed into a consuming fire. My plan required a prop. I found what I needed online, a glossy, professional-looking brochure for the New Mexico Community Foundation. I left it on the polished coffee table in the living room, strategically opened to a page detailing how to establish large-scale charitable trusts and legacy endowments. It was a beautiful piece of bait, promising a world of philanthropy they could not comprehend. Later that evening, as I sat in my armchair pretending to doze, I watched Tiffany through my eyelashes. She picked it up, her movements. Casual at first, then her eyes narrowing as she absorbed the words on the page. I saw the flicker of alarm, the quick, calculating look she shot in my direction. She put it down abruptly when she thought I was stirring her expression, a mask of nonchalance. But the seed was planted. The idea that their money might be destined for someone else had been introduced into the plot. A few days after that, I baited the hook further. While Mark was in the room scrolling through his phone, I made a call to my old friend Agnes. I spoke in deliberately audible, slightly frail tones. "Yes, Agnes." I said, "I'm just getting everything in order now. You know how important it is to have a solid plan for the future. Richard always said to leave things better than you found them." I saw Mark's head snap up from his phone, his posture suddenly alert. He was listening. He was worried. Their greed, the very character flaw that had driven their neglect, was now the engine that would drive their discovery of their own ruin. They would start digging, certain they were about to unearth a plot to steal their treasure. They would become the frantic, paranoid antagonists searching for clues to a conspiracy that existed only in their own entitled minds. They never suspected they weren't the heroes of this story. They were simply digging their own graves, and I had just handed them the shovels. Their next scene, I knew, would be one of hushed, panicked whispers in the dark. And I would be listening. The bait was taken sooner than I expected. It happened late one night, 2 days after my phone call to Agnes. I was reading in my bed, the house settled into a false tranquility, when I heard their voices from the hallway. They were trying to whisper, but greed has a sharp, piercing quality that travels through walls. I quietly got up and stood by my door. The cool, solid wood, a barrier between my world and theirs. I was an audience of one to their desperate, improvised scene. "She's doing something with the money, Mark, I'm telling you." Tiffany hissed, her voice a venomous whisper. "That brochure, the phone call with that old bat Agnes. She's planning to give it all away. To charity. That's our money. Our children's future. The inheritance your father wanted us to have." Her casual blasphemy of Richard's memory sent a shard of ice through my veins. "What do you want me to do, Tiff?" Mark's voice was a weak, pathetic whine, the sound of a man who had long ago traded his spine for a quiet life. "We can't just take it." "No, you idiot, we don't take it." She snapped back, her impatience palpable. "We get control. We need to get durable power of attorney. We need to take over her finances before she gives everything to a foundation for stray cats or something. Dr. Peterson will never sign off on it." Mark argued a flicker of his old self, the boy who used to know right from wrong. Not after she went to him behind our backs. He'll say she's perfectly competent. Then we find another doctor. The whisper rose in pitch, sharp with frustration. Someone who will say she's not. Someone who understands. We can say she's having delusions, that she's a danger to herself. It's not hard, Mark. We just have to be smart about it. I leaned my head against the door, my heart a cold, steady drum. The words were a cold, hard confirmation of everything I had suspected. This was never about my health. It was always about the money. Their frantic whispers were the last piece of evidence I needed, not for a lawyer, but for my own conscience. Any lingering flicker of maternal doubt, any sentimental hope that I had misjudged them, was extinguished forever. They were no longer my son and his wife. They were conspirators plotting to steal not just my money, but my mind, my autonomy, my very self. Their narrative required a mad old woman, and they were willing to create one. Justice, I have learned, does not always arrive with a thunderclap. Sometimes it arrives with the quiet rustle of an envelope delivered by the United States Postal Service. The letter that would detonate their world arrived on a Friday. It was not a dramatic hand-delivered summons from a grim-faced process server. It was a simple, crisp business envelope made of heavy, cream-colored paper bearing the elegant letterhead of Albright and Associates Attorneys at Law. It was addressed not to me, but to Mr. and Mrs. Mark Reed. I was in the kitchen, making my afternoon tea, when Tiffany brought in the mail. She sorted through it with her usual air of bored impatience, bills, catalogs, junk mail. Then she stopped. Her perfectly manicured fingers paused on the heavy envelope. She tore it open, her movements sharp and aggressive. I watched her from across the room, my face a mask of placid indifference. I continued to slowly stir my tea, the gentle clinking of the spoon against the porcelain, the only sound in the room. I watched as her eyes scanned the contents of the single sheet of paper. I saw the moment the words registered. The color drained from her expertly made-up face, leaving it a sickly, chalky white. Her mouth fell slightly open. Her hand, the one holding the letter, began to tremble, and the single sheet of paper, the harbinger of their ruin, fluttered from her grasp and landed silently on the polished tile floor. Mark came in, then drawn by the sudden heavy silence. He saw his wife's face, the letter on the floor, and his own expression shifted from casual indifference to alarm. "Tiff, what is it? What's wrong?" He picked up the letter. I already knew what it said. It was not an emotional plea or an angry accusation. It was a formal legal notification, a document of devastating clarity. It informed them that as of the date of my signature, 10 days prior, my last will and testament had been officially superseded. It stated that a new will had been executed and filed with the Sandoval County Probate Court. And it specified in cold, hard legal language that any previous power of attorney they may have held or believed they held had been legally and irrevocably revoked. There was no emotion in the letter, just the unassailable truth printed in black ink on a piece of paper that had just rewritten their entire future. The climax of their story had arrived, and they hadn't even known the curtain was rising. The aftermath was exactly as Sarah Albright had predicted it would be. In every story of this kind, the antagonists react with a predictable sequence of emotions, stunned disbelief, followed by frantic, impotent rage. After Mark read the letter, a heavy, shocked silence descended on the house. Then the frantic whispers began again, this time not in the hallway, but in the closed-off space of their master bedroom. I could hear the murmur of their voices, the sharp, panicked tones of people whose well-scripted world had just imploded. Their world, a fragile structure built on the assumption of my frailty and their inheritance, was collapsing in real time. The calls began. Not to me, of course. My role in their drama was for the moment over. They called their own lawyer, a man whose expertise was in real estate, not complex estate law. They called the bank. They called anyone they thought could reverse the irreversible, could undo what I had done. That evening, as I sat in my armchair reading my phone, which had been so silent for days, began to light up. It was a character trying to force their way back into a scene from which they had been written out. Mark. I let it go to voicemail. A moment later, it rang again. Tiffany. I silenced the ringer. The screen lit up again and again. Mark. Tiffany. Mark. The calls came one after another, a desperate digital barrage against the fortress of my silence. I did not answer. I sat in my comfortable chair sipping my chamomile tea, and I let the phone vibrate on the table beside me. Each unanswered call, a small, satisfying chime of my reclaimed freedom. Each frantic voicemail they left a chaotic mixture of disbelief, rage, and eventually a pathetic sort of pleading, was a testament to their complete and utter powerlessness. They had built their entire future on a lie on the fragile premise of my demise. The truth had just sent them the bill, and they had no way to pay it. The silence they had tried to impose on me had become my greatest weapon. And it was deafening. They confronted me that night. In their minds, this was the climactic scene where the bewildered old woman breaks down and confesses her confusion, allowing them to sweep in as saviors. They didn't knock on my bedroom door. They burst in, forgoing the last vestiges of respect. Their faces were masks of fury and disbelief. Tiffany held the lawyer's letter in her shaking hand, waving it like a weapon. "What is this?" she shrieked, her voice shrill and ugly. "What have you done? You can't do this." I looked up from my book, my expression calm. I carefully placed my bookmark between the pages before setting it down. My heart was a steady, even rhythm in my chest. "I have taken care of my affairs," I said simply. "It is what any responsible person of my age does. This is our house, our future." Mark finally found his voice, though it was a pathetic, broken sound, the cry of a child who has had his favorite toy taken away. "Mom, how could you do this to us after everything we've done for you?" I let his words hang in the air, heavy with their own bitter irony. "Everything you've done for me?" I finally looked directly at my son, and for the first time in years, he was forced to meet my gaze. There was nowhere else for him to look. "What exactly have you done for me, Mark, besides wait for me to die?" My voice was soft, yes, but it carried the unwavering weight of steel. It was the voice of clarity, not revenge. "You left me to die. You hoped my health would fail so you could inherit a life you didn't earn. You dismissed my very existence as less important than a business brunch. You plotted in the hallway to have me declared incompetent." Their faces went pale. The script had been flipped, and they had no lines. "You forgot one very important thing," I continued, my voice never rising. "The house was never yours to inherit. As my lawyer's letter explained, this house is held in a trust that I alone control. It is mine." I stood up, feeling a strength in my limbs I hadn't felt in years. "And now this space is no longer yours. You have 60 days to vacate the premises. I suggest you start packing." I didn't take up space in their story. I was the space, and I was taking it back. The 60 days that followed were a masterclass in tense, bitter silence. They were no longer characters in a drama. They were ghosts, haunting a house that had already rejected them. They packed their belongings with a sullen, resentful fury, their movements jerky and angry. Tiffany slammed boxes. Mark drank. I stayed in my wing of the house reading, listening to music and letting the quiet heal the spaces they had wounded. I did not engage. I did not gloat. I simply existed in my own peaceful narrative while theirs burned itself out. On the final day, a large moving truck rumbled up the driveway. I watched from the window as they loaded the last of their lives, the oversized furniture, the endless boxes of clothes, the artifacts of a life built on a faulty foundation. When the truck finally pulled away, leaving behind nothing but the faint smell of diesel and an echo of their entitlement, a profound quiet descended upon the house. It was not an empty quiet. It was a whole quiet. It was the sound of peace. My mornings are different now. Not the kind of quiet that aches with loneliness, but the kind that feels like a soft, deep exhale after holding your breath for too long. I spend my days reclaiming my home, not just as a physical space, but as a sanctuary of my own story. I moved Richard's big, comfortable recliner back to its rightful place by the fireplace. I filled the rooms with the classical music he loved, letting the notes wash away the memory of their sharp, angry whispers. The air smells of brewing coffee and baking bread, now not expensive perfume and resentment. James Peterson visits often, not as a doctor but as a friend. We sit on the patio, watching the Sandia Mountains turn a deep, bruised purple in the setting sun, and we talk about everything and nothing. Last month, the first grant from the Richard and Eleanor Reed Foundation for Elder Dignity was awarded to a local legal aid society that specializes in elder advocacy. I received a formal letter of thanks, which I framed and placed on Richard's old desk. I didn't keep the house to live in luxury. I kept it to live in dignity. I am not the owner of this house. I am its custodian, a custodian of a legacy of love and of a potent, necessary lesson in consequences. I didn't lose a son. I lost the illusion that he ever truly saw me. And in losing that illusion, I found myself. I know I am not the only character in this kind of story. My narrative may have names and places unique to me, but its themes are universal. So if you are listening to this, if my story has stirred something in you, a flicker of recognition, a memory of being made to feel like a burden in the very life you helped build, then this final chapter is for you. If you have ever been called dead weight after a lifetime of shouldering the load, if you have ever been treated like a guest in the home your love and labor made possible, if you have ever stayed silent just to keep a peace that was never truly peaceful, then hear this. You are not alone. We are a silent sorority, a quiet legion of women who have been underestimated, overlooked, and undervalued. They mistook our patience for permission. They mistook our silence for surrender. Your worth does not expire with age. Your value is not measured by your current usefulness to others. We are not background characters in their lives. We are the reason they have lives to begin with. We were never the parasites. We were the foundation. And when the foundation decides to shift, the whole house falls. Do not wait for them to forget who you are to remember it yourself. Do not let them turn you into a stranger in the house you helped build. Keep your name on the deed. Keep your power in your own hands. And always, always keep the number of a loyal friend. People forget. Paper remembers. Justice doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers in the precise, irrefutable language of a legal document. Let me say it plainly. My son and daughter-in-law hoped my story would end with a quiet, convenient death. Instead, my story ends with the founding of a legacy that will outlive them and their greed. I am not the woman they forgot. I am the woman who remembered herself, and I hope if you see yourself anywhere in these pages that you will remember yourself too. Your story is not over. You are still the author. It is never too late to write a new ending. Thank you for watching True Stories from Forgotten Mothers. If these stories stir something in you, something that whispers, "I thought I was the only one," then know that this is your community. Don't forget to subscribe to True Stories from Forgotten Mothers and hit the notification bell so you never miss a testament to the quiet strength of women who refuse to be erased. Join us, and let's remember together.